Hi, my name is Peter Schiavone, Director of Veterans Services for the town of Braintree, and this is Veterans Corner. On our show, we will try to educate the public on veterans benefits, the history of veterans in Braintree, and we'll also do a lot of historical stuff on Medal of Honor recipients and history in Braintree regarding veterans organizations and military history. I have with me my special guest, Tom Grace, who's a registered historian on the Medal of Honor, and Tom recently interviewed Tom Hudner, who is the former Commissioner of Veterans Services for the state of Massachusetts and a Medal of Honor recipient in the Korean War. Tom, you had a good interview with Tom Hudner, and we're going to see that shortly. How'd you feel interviewing another Medal of Honor recipient? This is not your first one, we know, but what were your feelings during the interview?
Well, thank you very much for being a guest here again, Peter. I appreciate it. Yeah, we had a real nice visit. His Medal of Honor action actually is it's really legendary with naval aviation. It occurred during really an epic struggle between really three armies, North Korean, Red Chinese, Communist Chinese against United Nations, most of which were United States forces, Marines and Army units, specifically 1st Marine Division. And it occurred at a place called the Chosin Reservoir. The Chosin Reservoir is north in the Korean Peninsula. It's in the northern portion of North Korea. At that particular time, right around the 27th of November, roughly 500,000 Chinese Communist forces poured over the Yalu River, surrounding the Marine and Army units in the vicinity of the Chosin Reservoir. And it actually, there were a lot of, there was some great valor shown during that particular battle.
As was Chesty Puller.
Yeah, absolutely, as was great suffering as well. Based on the weather conditions. The weather conditions get down to below 20 degrees Fahrenheit. And you mentioned Chesty Puller. Chesty always maintained that when they were surrounded, he always said, listen, this was not a retreat. What we found was there was just more behind us than in front of us, so we about-faced and attacked.
Chesty, every time I think of the Chosin Reservoir, I think of Chesty Puller. His famous comment when he learned that he was surrounded, he says, well, wonderful, now we can attack in every direction.
Absolutely.
That was his famous quote, and it always stuck with me, and I'm sure that that gave his men some incentive to fight on, and they did.
Yeah, they sure did. It was, like I say, it was really a tough go, and they really required a needed air support, and that's where Mr. Hudner, he flew a Corsair, and you know, the people that are listening really have to understand that this particular aircraft was not the type of aircraft that, you know, one could just initially crash land on the side of a mountain to try to save someone else's life. And he actually did this. You can't practice this. The way that the wings came down off it, it's a wonder it didn't tip over. It's just an amazing action. And you know, again, like I say, we'll let
just to bring our viewers a little up to date, we're going to have the interview with Tom Hudner. But what Tom Hudner did was basically land his jet on the side of a mountain to save a fellow pilot who had crashed, was actually shot down, I believe, and had crashed. He was still alive in the cockpit, but trapped. Tom Hudner landed his plane and tried to get out of his plane. Got out of his plane to help his comrade, and his efforts were in vain. But his actions were heroic, and we'll play the tape now of Tom Grace interviewing Tom Hudner in his home. I believe it was his home.
Yeah, it was in his home.
Concord, Mass.
Yeah, he was gracious enough to allow me to come to his home and sit down with him, and we spent some time together and talked, and then we had our interview, and it really went well. But really, it's heartbreaking the way, you know, the Medal of Honor action you know, took place, and you know, these things, you know, an issue like this, it just the loyalty that he showed. I mean, he just can't. He
It's
was alone. He
unmatched,
was
yeah.
by himself, and he kind of downplays it a bit. But there's nothing. There's no downplaying. You know what he did that day.
Well, most of our Medal of Honor recipients seem
Yeah.
very humble. We'll run that tape now, and I hope you enjoy this tape.
Today we're lucky enough to have another American legend on Braintree Community Television who earned the Medal of Honor in the Korean conflict. I'd like to welcome Mr. Thomas Hudner with us today. Thank you very much
Glad to be
for
here.
being here today. We'd like to talk initially about your upbringing. You're initially from Massachusetts.
Yes. Yes, I was born and grew up in Fall River in 1924. And so it was some years before the Depression, so I actually I grew up in the Depression. During the Depression and during the time that everything was very unsettled over in Europe, which eventually led into World War II. And then I went to school, the public schools in Fall River, then went to freshman year of high school in Taunton, at the time Coyle High School, which I think is now Coyle Cassidy High School. Then I went to Phillips Academy in Andover. Then went down to the Naval Academy with a class of 1947. Went in there in 1943, but it was only a 3-year class because of the war, which shortened the course at both the Naval and the military academies. Graduated in 1946 and was assigned to a cruiser that was out in China. This was less than a year after World War II was over, and it was very interesting to be out there in China to see how devastated portions of China were. And after being out there for about 6 months, operating primarily between Tsingtao, China, up in the north, and Shanghai, the ship was ordered back home to the States, and as soon as I got home, I had orders waiting for me to go back out to Pearl Harbor in communications, where I was for about a year. And while there, the Navy requested applications for flight training because they needed to train a lot of pilots, because the overwhelming majority of pilots during World War II were reserve officers, and they needed to fill a gap that was quickly being created. So I went to Pensacola in 1948. Part of my flight training was in Pensacola, and I finished up in Corpus Christi, and I got my wings in August of 1949. And then it turns out that my first tour was in a squadron at Naval Air Station Quonset Point, which no longer exists, but Quonset is down in Narragansett Bay, just across from the Naval War College in Newport. And it was while there that we deployed for the Mediterranean on what was supposed to have been a routine 6-month deployment when the Korean War broke out.
When you were assigned to a carrier at that point?
Yeah. I was assigned to a carrier-based squadron at Quonset. We did all of our flying out of there, and you don't, in the training cycle in naval aviation, after you return from a deployment, your squadron regroups, refreshes, gets new airplanes, new pilots, and we don't have anything to do with the carrier for at least 3 months after we get back. And then in anticipation of another deployment, then we concentrate a lot going out to the carrier. So our carrier was mostly up in Boston, because they don't have they did not at the time have the facilities for full support of a carrier at Quonset Point. So as time went on, we built up more and more for carrier work until we deployed in early May of 1950.
Were you flying the Corsair at this point?
Yes, yes.
Where was it? Was that the USS Leyte at that point?
That was USS Leyte, yes.
How a lot of the people don't understand the difficulties of landing on a carrier.
Yes.
Could you expound on that a bit?
Well, what sets carrier aviation off from any other types of flying is landing on the ship. And the great advantage of naval tactical aviation is its ability to move all over the world, almost any place where air power is needed. And the Navy has a great advantage in being able to get very close offshore to any place in the world without having to get diplomatic clearance to open up an air base or to fly over places from shore-based stations. So this is a carrier. And in those days, the carriers we were flying from were World War II aircraft carriers. They were the Essex class, of which there were 24, almost all of them in the West Pacific. And those old aircraft carriers, which just displaced about 30,000 tons, were about a little over 800 feet long. And it's just that the operation was we'd fly off the front end of the ship and land on the back end. And we carry about 85 aircraft. When you had all aircraft up on deck, you usually didn't have enough room to fly off the bow without being aided off, so we oftentimes would catapult it off. And when they got enough airplanes off so that we had enough deck run, we'd take off, I'm guessing in about 400 feet. And then the landings in those days consisted of landing in an area where you had about 8 or 10 cables stretched across the deck, and a big, what they call a series of 5 barriers, which were cables strung across the forward end of the landing area, so that if you didn't catch a wire, or your hook broke, or you had some sort of problem, these barriers would stop you before flying up forward where there may be some airplanes parked from previous landings. Things are very different today, but basically they're the same.
Seems like it was very difficult to try to, there's a lot of touch and feel. You have C's pitching,
Yeah.
just from what I've read.
Well, it's moving all the time, and people often say, my Lord, trying to land on a moving carrier, you've got to move. Part of aerodynamics in flying is what they call relative wind when you're flying into the wind. And carrier operations, you try to fly into the wind. So there'd be wind coming down the deck, and the higher the wind is, I shouldn't say the easier it is to land on board, but the faster you can be, because the higher the wind is, the faster you are, you can still seek to get, they call a relative wind of about 30 to 35 knots over the deck. And you are landing on an unstable platform. The ship can be rolling, the ship can be pitching, or it could be heaving, just going up and down, or it could be making an irregular course through the water. And so one of the critical points in your landing is, where is the carrier deck when you get to it? Or you have no control, you can't slow down or speed up to get the deck when it's at its optimum position for landing, so that sometimes the deck is too high, you'd have to take a wave off, or it's too It's too low, you can't dive for it because that's dangerous. You'd have to make a go-around or a wave off.
So there must have been quite a few crashes.
Well, the improvements in carrier aviation since the end of World War II, or actually since the end of Korea, have been so dramatic that it's I won't say much safer, but the carrier accident rate is only about 10% of what it was when we were flying. And a lot of that's attributable to we call the angled deck. You look at an aircraft carrier and it's not just a conventional straight deck, but the flight deck angles off at 10 degrees. And this means that when you come down to make a landing, if anything happens, you have a whole clear deck in front of you and you can take off and come around again. Plus the optical landing system that they use today compared to what we had gives you much more, enables you to get much more precise control over the airplane. And so even though we used to land an aircraft aboard at about 85 knots, they'll land aboard at about 135 knots. But with all these improvements, with an airplane that weighs, well, compared to the 12,000 some pounds that we flew, they may be 45 or 50,000 pounds today. The accident rate's only about 10% of what it used to be.
It says a lot for the type of pilot that you were.
Yeah.
While you were on the USS Leyte, Korea broke out.
Yes.
A little bit about the Korean War. What exactly was it?
Well,
It's often called the Forgotten War, the Korean conflict.
well, the Forgotten War, because it was overlooked, you might say, because World War II was the greatest, most comprehensive, intense war in the history of the world. And we had over 15 million Americans that were directly involved in that war. For us, it lasted about a little over 3.5 years. Actually, it started almost 2 years before we got involved in it. It affected all of Europe, a lot of Asia, and of course the United States. But it was an all-encompassing war. Early in the 1960s, we got involved in Vietnam, and I got involved in the Vietnam War, which turned out to be very divisive. We were fighting a war as far away from home as Korea was. A lot of acrimony resulted from that war. It ended up in a stalemate, and for a lot of us, considered it to have been a loss, but then for a lot of others of us, we consider it to be a victory of sorts. But because of the relative, was a recency, fairly recent compared to the Korean War, there are more people who were involved in the Vietnam War than there were in the Korean War, so they think of it. And because the Korean War was surrounded by World War II and then the most recent, now excluding the Gulf War, people just forget Korea. And yet, in my mind, I feel that Korea was a much, much more critical war to the history, not only of Korea and the United States, but to the world than the Vietnam War was. And a lot of the Korean War veterans, I shouldn't say resentful, there is resent on the part of some of them, but there's disappointment that you talk about wars, if it's not about World War II, it's about the Vietnam War, and people just overlooking the Korean War completely, whereas it was just as bad and in many ways much worse than the Vietnam War for everybody concerned, and especially the poor guys on the ground.
The weather conditions were atrocious.
Yeah, they were. Ironically, the central part of Korea could be very hot and very dry and very uncomfortable during the summer months. And in the early phases of the war, when we started fighting, which was starting at the end of June of 1950, our troops were all complaining about the heat. And it was after we started moving up north again, as winter was coming, it began to get pretty cold, and our troops were not equipped for it. Very few of the troops had the equipment they should have, particularly boots and just warm clothing. And turns out to be what they call a 100-year winter. It was the worst winter they would have had in about 100 years. Everybody suffered from it. It was not only our own troops for whom it was dreadful, but you can just imagine the Chinese, who were so much more poorly equipped than ours were. So it was a very, very bitter war in many respects, but what everybody who was there during the winter months remember is the literally ungodly cold that they had to suffer through.
When did you arrive in Korea with the USSR?
Well, going back to leaving Quonset Point for the Mediterranean, we left in May, and were operating in the Mediterranean at the time the war broke out, 26th of June of 1950. We continued to operate for about a month and a half. It took a while for us to realize how bad things were going in Korea. And those of us in the ship were privy to very little news. In those days, you didn't have access to news. If you could go into port, you may find an English newspaper, and what we'd get when we'd go ashore, even in the English newspapers weren't very full of news. It was just not much deeper than the headlines themselves. But we did unexpectedly, to us, get the word on the 8th of August when we were anchored off Beirut, Lebanon, which is at the extreme eastern end of the Mediterranean, that we were going to go to Korea. So we went the long way around. The Suez Canal wasn't available to us at that time, so we went from Lebanon all the way through the Mediterranean, past Gibraltar and back to Norfolk, and then down, spent 10 days in Norfolk, then down through the Panama Canal and up to San Diego, out to Hawaii, then to Japan. Then we started operating on, I think, our first flight in the Korean area was on the 8th of October. And this was 3 weeks after the extremely successful amphibious invasion at Incheon, which literally turned the early phase of the war around completely. So our first flying was in support of our troops to help them push their way up towards and into North Korea at a time when General MacArthur had hoped to go all the way up to the Manchurian border, which was the Yalu River.
Now, what were some of your typical missions?
Well, when we first arrived there were about, I'd say, 4 general types of mission. There were pre-targeted targets. We'd be told beforehand we're going to hit a warehouse, or we're going to hit some storage buildings or something of military value. And a mission similar to that would be where we wouldn't know where we were going, except that, we'd fly in towards the beach and check into a command ship, and we'd be designated targets at that time. and have to figure out from the charts we had on board and with help from them where these targets were and then go after them. For such targets we had bombs, we had rockets, napalm, and our aircraft carried 50 caliber ammunition. Then a third type of mission was armed reconnaissance, where we'd be given a geographic area to fly around just looking for targets of opportunity. Anything that could have any conceivable use to the enemy we'd try to destroy. Then the fourth type of mission, which I think was by far the most popular for almost all of us, what they call close air support. And that was to fly very close to our troops in the vicinity of enemy forces and try to protect our troops, help them advance or keep from being overrun by the enemy. And it was much more personal because you could see our troops on the ground, and we felt we're doing something for our fellow warriors.
Close infantry support, you were literally very close to the ground. How,
Yeah.
as an example, how, altitude-wise, how high would you fly?
Well, a lot of it depended upon the circumstances. First of all, when we started flying close air support, it was up in the mountains, and it was a very mountainous area. Some of the peaks were up as high as 6,000 feet. And our troops, for the most part, were on the mountain roads, and they would be attacked by the North Koreans and eventually by the Chinese from up in the hills. So we had to be very careful when we were making strafing runs on the enemy not to get too low. We had to worry both about our height above the ground and also the nature of the terrain, so that most of the time we couldn't fly straight ahead for very long before you had to turn one way or another to keep from flying into the mountainsides. So at times we could get as low as 100 feet. I'm sure we did get that low. Other times we'd probably be constrained by the terrain, so that we'd do the same type of thing but at higher altitudes, but we'd lose some accuracy when we get up that high.
Could you describe the aircraft you flew?
Well, we had Corsairs, Corsairs were a World War II aircraft. It was designed well before World War II, completely new design airplane on which they could put in a new engine, which had just been designed and developed by Pratt & Whitney Aircraft down in Hartford, Connecticut. It was very powerful. The engine was very powerful, making the airplane powerful. But it had a few design characteristics that made it a little bit dangerous to fly aboard aircraft. And it was distinguishable from almost any other airplane because it had what they called inverted gull wings. The wings would come down from the fuselage at an angle, and then about 6 feet out from where they came down, then they'd come up again, which actually gave the airplane more stability than otherwise. I don't think this was planned in the design. The reason they had the design of that airplane with the gull wing like that was because the engine developed so much power that in order to harness that power, they had to have a big propeller. And propellers can absorb the power of the engine either by the length of the blades or the number of blades, and even by the width of the blades. And in order to absorb the power, the blades were so long that if you ever it tilted up very high in a landing, especially a carrier landing where your nose would go forward after you caught the wire. You'd continually chew up the ground of the flight deck with the long blades. So they couldn't make the wheel struts any longer without losing a lot of strength. So someone came up with the idea of putting the wheel struts into the lower portion of the wing, which would have the same effect of raising the whole aircraft. And that's how it got its design. And the engineers were able to correct several of these undesirable characteristics of the airplane to make them safe for carrier work. But by the time they got these developed, World War II was almost over. But in the meantime, the Marines flew them. The Marines loved the airplane. It could handle the Zeros, which are the primary Japanese fighters. It did extremely well with them. And the Navy was just beginning to get a lot of them when the war was over. So after the war was over, they had thousands of F-4Us. And when the Korean War started, they pulled a lot of those Corsairs out of the boneyard in Arizona, where they were been put after World War II to preserve them.
How was it to fly? Was it pretty responsive?
It was a good airplane. Yes, it was responsive. The visibility from the cockpit, the model we flew, was quite good. We didn't have autopilots in our airplanes, but we could fairly easily, what they call, trim them up so you could fly with your hands off quite a bit. Although every time you change your power settings, change anything at all, I'd put the aircraft slightly out of trim, so you had to trim it up again. It was fast, it turned quite well, and they had sufficient armor in there so that you had a pretty good chance of avoiding serious injury if you got in a fight at all. Visibility from the cockpit straight ahead was probably one of the biggest complaints because the nose is so long, 13.5 feet from the pilot's head to the forwardmost end of the cowling. And that made carrier landings pretty hard because you couldn't, when you make a carrier landing in those days, the nose was cocked up for slow flight. It was very hard to see around it. And you had to adjust your approach so that you'd be turning throughout the whole approach to the ship, be turning so you could see the flight deck, whereas if you were to come in from very far from behind, straight up, you couldn't see the stern of the ship or the landing signal officer was helping you come in.
Yeah, I heard it was definitely not an easy aircraft to land on a carrier. I mean, it had the tricycle landing gear, but it had two. It was a tail dragger. Is that what they like to call it? Tail draggers? What
this wasn't tricycle.
Yeah.
This was the conventional tail wheel airplane, yes.
And it, obviously you can't see with that big cowling. And it's got to be very difficult to try to land
No,
on.
you're looking, you're looking out through the corner of your eye. You line yourself up on a runway at a shore field, and there's several stripes going up and down the runway, or the edge of the runway itself. You're looking to make sure you're flying parallel to them. And you can stick your head out a little bit, but you can't see very much. So that once you're down on the ground, then your nose is cocked up again. Everything is looking from one side to the other. It's not like sitting in your car and seeing straight ahead.
That was our first segment of the interview with Thomas Hudner, Medal of Honor recipient in the Korean War. I think he gave us a pretty good description of his opinion of how the war was and the bitterness of the cold weather, and also a good description of naval aviation, how to land on a carrier. I mean, I just can't imagine. He sounds like such a brilliant man. He sounds like a bright guy, because he's very elderly now. But I think that to land a plane on an aircraft carrier, to me, is like amazing. And he gave a little interesting talk on that, and also the description of the Corsair plane. Well, we're going to come back and do the second segment, Tom's interview with Tom Hudner. And before we break today, do you have anything to add to in the first segment here that we discussed about the Forgotten War? I know that ground support, when I was in Vietnam, we had helicopters, which were our main support. We had jets fly support for us too, and I mean, I don't know how we would have done without it.
Yeah, the close air
support. It was kind of
support.
new in Korea, I think.
Yeah, the close air support was really vital in Korea, based on the fact that you had the forces in close proximity of each other. It was imperative to have that close air support. His Medal of Honor action, that particular aircraft that he flew, I just wanted to expound on the fact that that was probably a very difficult, if not one of the more difficult World War II era fighters to try to crash land into a Korean mountainside. I had a friend who flew Corsairs later on during World War II. The Japanese were deathly afraid of this particular aircraft. They nicknamed it Whistling Death. In optimum conditions, when it was when it was flying against any type of an enemy, whether they were in aerial combat or whether they were flying fast, they used them quite a bit. Actually, our last show was on Peleliu, and when Mr. Pope landed on Peleliu, they used the Corsairs quite a bit to use napalm against them. But I can't emphasize enough that this particular aircraft and the way that he tried or had to fly it to crash land in the Korean mountainside to save Jesse Brown, who was a squadron mate of his, I just can't emphasize enough that very, 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 very difficult to do. And in our next segment, that's what we'll talk about. And he'll talk about, he nonchalantly talks about how, what his Medal of Honor action entailed, but just an amazing story.
He also mentioned that he graduated from the Naval Academy in 1946, and who were some of his classmates?
Yeah, actually, he graduated with President Carter and Admiral James Stockdale, who was a Medal of Honor recipient from Vietnam. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I was very angry about, and still am, was he was Ross Perot's running mate in the 1992 presidential election, and he was made fun of quite a few times on TV. And I don't know, I have a hard time with, if anyone knows what Admiral Stockdale went through, I think the only people that should be allowed to make fun of a man of his character is someone who went through exactly what he went through.
He was a POW, and
he was a POW,
the famous Hanoi Hilton, and he was beaten daily and interrogated and tried to be completely broken to give the enemy information. And he, I believe, he organized.
He basically was the leader of all the POWs because he was senior in rank, and he always maintained that he took a lot of beatings. They had a lot of little rope tricks that they did, and to this day, the poor guy, he limps. He was away from his family for over 7 years, and it's my own. It's not the view of the show or anything. It's just my own personal thing. I think it was in bad taste to try to do to him what they did.
It was a TV show that was trying to they sacrifice people's integrity to get entertainment, and I agree with you. It was in poor taste, and I think that maybe they realize that now, hopefully. But we'll end on that note, and we'll do another segment on the Medal of Honor recipient Tom Hudner. And let's remember, always remember that men like Tom Hudner don't come around too often. Very heroic man, and remember that he fought for freedom, and freedom is not free.